Welcome to Josie to Lagos, an African podcast from Africa for Africa. Why? Because we need this kind of content. We need to be able to unpack the African moment and continue to ask ourselves, what's up with Africa and why are we in the position that we're in? So today we're going to talk about the African Union. Why are we talking about the African Union? Why should any African care? Hopefully by the end of this episode, it will all make sense. I want to start off by pointing out that there's a power disparity between African states and global powerhouses. If you look at Europe, America, China, Russia, we're not actually playing on the same field. So there's a need for a common voice, common platform to discuss matters with the global community. Even at face value, it begins to become transparent and apparent why there is a need for an effective African Union. But there's some issues that we need to discuss about Africa that are critical to understand and show why there's a need for Africa to get its act together. Africa is a young continent. Right now, we're sitting on a population of 1.3 billion people. That's 16% of the current global population. But the median age in Africa is 20, whilst the worldwide median is 30. In fact, in Europe and Japan, the medians actually are slightly higher. So Africa is a very young continent. By 2034, the African continent will have a larger working age population than either China or India. And a large number of that population will actually be under 25. By 2050, the projections are that Africa is going to be the world's most populated region. The population is forecast to rise to roughly 2.5 billion by 2030, and half of those Africans will be under the age of 25. So not only is Africa a young continent now, it will continue to be a young continent for the foreseeable future, in fact, for the next 30 years, and the population is going to almost double. So it's critical that we get our act together at this particular moment. An interesting element of Africa is that 20% of the global land surface area is actually in Africa. 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is also in Africa. That means that there's a lot of potential in terms of the youthfulness and the land in Africa. Normally, we only talk about the minerals. Africa's got the minerals. Africa is producing rubber, cocoa, and all of these implements that are used by the Western world. But there's also just like a large market space as well as a large landmass which can be used. You can fit China and the United States of America into Africa with lots of room to spare. The economy of Africa is such that you have this African GDP of 7 trillion US dollars. That's a lot of money, but you don't have a lot of that money actually retained in Africa. If you compare Africa to the other regional blocks, 50% of trade in Asia is internal, 70% of trade in Europe is internal, 40% of trade in North America is internal, but Africa only has 12% of trade happening intra-Africa, internally within Africa. So that does show that even though there's a lot of money coming out of the space continentally, a lot of it is not actually just remaining in the continent. The consumer expenditure actually shows that Africa is a sizable player and one worth taking seriously. Consumer expenditure on the continent has grown at a compound annual rate of 3.9% since 2010. The expenditure was actually 1.4 trillion in 2015, and that figure is expected to reach 2.1 trillion by 2025 and 2.5 trillion by 2030. Some of these projections are obviously affected very dramatically by the COVID-19 crisis, but you are still going to see large consumer expenditure in Africa simply because you have this massive growing population. And of course, they need to buy resources, goods, services, that kind of thing. So a lot of people are referring to this phenomena that I've described to you as the population dividend. But the population dividend in and of itself has no value. It can either lead to risks and massive opportunities. So if we look at it, if you get it properly harnessed, it leads to strong economic growth, it leads to Africa becoming a strong regional player, and it leads to Africa becoming even bigger than China and India on the global stage. However, improperly managed, it could lead to economic inequality, poor service delivery for civilians, and ultimately it could lead to increases in internal conflict and regional conflict. The reality is, when you think about environments where resources are not sufficiently distributed, we've seen it in Nigeria, in South Africa, even in Ghana, you have this wealthy elite that is formed, and then you have this mass which is poor and really struggling. And when you have this massive discrepancy, you see xenophobic attacks, you see regional antipathy, you see the rise of nationalism, and you also see a massive exodus of migrants, as we are seeing the African migrant problem in Europe. All of these things are interconnected. So what does this all have to do with anything? It critically has to do with this. Unless the African states can actually get their act together at this present moment, all of the issues I've discussed will not necessarily be assets, but will quickly become liabilities. It's very difficult to solve conflict when it involves 2-point-something billion people. It's already difficult enough as it is. So what is a fair assessment? If we were making a fair assessment at the present moment of the African Union, Julius Malema said the following about the African Union.
You speak about leaders in Africa. Do you think that SADC is playing the role that it's supposed to play?
There's no such a thing. SADC, there's no such a thing. AU, there's no such a thing. It's a group of all people who protect each other. They don't protect the interests of their people. It's a club. It's a gentleman club. They don't care. They don't call each other out. So they are unable to say, you are wrong here, you are wrong there. And therefore, this is how we need to fix it. And the way forward is that the youth must take politics serious. The youth must participate in politics. The youth must lead. Because most young people have left politics into the hands of older people who have nothing to do with that. AU has got a plan called 2063. and those people won't be there in 2063. That's why they can say 2063. They won't take responsibility. So we, the youth, we must stop suffering from political apathy and take the future into our own hands.
So that's what Julius Malema has said about the African Union. Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who was actually the AU chairperson in 2018, he had the following to say about the African Union and the African moment more broadly.
Africa's defining challenge is to create a pathway to prosperity for our people, especially young people. Elsewhere, this has been achieved through industrialization, but the growth trajectory that transformed Asia is not necessarily any longer a viable option for Africa simply because we waited too long to act. Technology has evolved so rapidly in recent years that Africa's window to follow that strategy is narrowing much more rapidly than previously understood. We are running out of time, and we must act now to save Africa from permanent deprivation.
So that's what Paul Kagame had to say. If you listen to the analysis on Africa from Paul Kagame, from Julius Malema, the interpretation that you get is not very glowing. But if you listen to the management consultants and the investment bankers, they generally have a different narrative about Africa. Some of them have actually compared Africa to the Asian tiger economies and used the narrative that the lions are on the rise, the African lions are on the rise. A tiger economy is a term used to describe several booming economies in Southeast Asia. The Asian tiger economies typically include Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan. The economic growth in each of the Asian tiger nations is usually export-led, but with sophisticated financial and trading hubs. If you think about the management consultant narrative of Africa, I've often been skeptical of how they describe Africa. And it's always seemed to me to have a discrepancy to the reality of the African condition, the on-the-ground condition, the grassroots condition. And I think it's simply because of three reasons. Management consultants often live and work from Sandton, Cape Town, Abuja, Lagos, and they're not working amongst the people. They're working in these fancy offices with air conditioning, with fiber internet, with global comms, and they are watching CNN, Bloomberg, and they are not fully on the ground, even as they are providing a consultancy in those particular area. Number two, they are often looking at the pure macroeconomic indicators, the gross domestic product, inflation, the balance of trade, consumer spending, credit ratings. They're seldom actually focused on the quality of life issues and the good governance issues. And oftentimes they're insulated from the reality of those issues and they don't even know what they don't even know. But I'm also a bit skeptical about management consultants and investor narratives, investment banking narratives about Africa, because a lot of times there is a real reason to be skeptical about their conduct. If you look at the recent events, the Luanda leaks, which covered the involvement and wealth accumulation of Isabella dos Santos in Angola. If you look at the fish rot scandal, which looked at the massive fishing corruption that was happening in Namibia. If you look at the Gupta Gate and state capture scandal in South Africa, you often find that the management consultants were actually involved in that kind of activity, making sure that consulting fees were earned, making sure that some kind of kickback arrangements were done so that they could actually get the tenders. And then those particular powerful figures then got money from the management consultants, making sure that money was offshored. Oftentimes, you'll find that there is an involvement from investment bankers and there is an involvement from management consultants. So when they describe Africa, I actually take it with a pinch of salt. So if you were to ask me, what is my first take assessment of the African Union, of the African condition, I would say the following, and I would agree with some of the speakers who spoke earlier, Paul Kagame and Julius Malema. The first thing I would say is that the Union is not making reasonable progress in reasonable time. The AU project moves at a very slow pace. The pace is actually very unacceptable. If I give you some examples, the Agenda 2063, which we'll discuss a little bit later, it was conceptualized in 2013, but only adopted in 2015. There's 2 years to adopt something which should have just been easily and quickly adopted. The first progress report on the Agenda 2063 came out 7 years later after the idea was pushed at the African Union. That's not reasonable progress in reasonable time. It's something that actually reduces the competitive potential against other regional blocs and powerful global actors. And that's an economic assessment which is important, because if you're saying you want to be wealthy, if you're saying you want to reduce poverty, you have to be able to compete. And in order to be able to compete, you have to be able to deliver in reasonable time and actually operate at the speed of the global economy. 7 years to do the first progress report is simply not reflective of that, right? That's an example that just shows you that there's no reasonable progress in reasonable time within the African Union. I also want to say that the long-term plans, these plans which range from 50 years, are not at any given point realistic plans. If you just look at it at a face value, anytime somebody has a 50-year plan, that plan lacks urgency. it lacks accountability because the people who are committing to the plan are not reasonably going to be around to explain their failures. These kind of plans do smack of time buying, and African leaders have a history of committing to things that are in the very long term because then they don't have to actually produce their action plans, their progress reports, and they don't actually have to crystallize what are the smart goals in respect to those particular plans. The world is rapidly changing, and these kind of arrangements and strategic plans lack the requisite flexibility. In the business world these days, people often make a 1-year plan, 3-year plan, 10-year plan, but they don't try to make a 50-year plan because the dynamics of the environment are fast changing and you may need to move at a different pace. It's also very peculiar why African leaders are moving at such a slow pace when the pilot models of what they're trying to do have already been rolled out, tried and tested, and we already know what the tricky areas of the road are. You know, it took other countries a shorter amount of time to industrialize than it took the United Kingdom. That's because they were the first ones to really push for industrialization, and thus it took them a longer time. It took other countries half the time. So if we are trying to create a robust African body, why is it taking us so long to do that? I want to actually say as a third thing is that if you consider the nature of the African states that are making up the African Union, you will then begin to understand why the problems that exist. 23 of the African states which are members of the African Union are either one of the following. They can also be a combination of the following. Either they are dictatorships, if you look at countries like Uganda, Chad, Cameroon, or they are illegitimate dominant party states. The ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe is an example. They are dominant party states in Burundi, in Gabon, and in Togo. I say they are illegitimate dominant party states because they oftentimes do not win those elections freely and fairly. They oftentimes use the apparatus of the state to control the media, to suppress opposition leaders, to deny civilians their rights of free speech, their rights to protest, and then they also buy votes and they rig the elections outright. So when these dominant party states control the media, the police, the army, the electoral commissions, those winners of elections cannot truly walk around saying that they are legitimate governments. And then other governments are military regimes, if you look at Egypt. So some of these obviously are a conflation and a mixture, but you can fully appreciate how when you consider 23 of these states, you can clearly see these red flags. What does this mean? It means that the leaders of these states do not actually want to create an organization that can catch them out and give their citizens ideas. The gameplay or the game that they play is to say the right thing at the AU level while working to slow down the necessary reforms. They are actually not trying to see democratic and human rights reforms and media reforms in their home countries because they have an agenda and an incentive to stay in power. It's the people like Robert Mugabe who were dallying at the African Union level while they were oppressing their own people in Zimbabwe. He spoke the right Pan-African intellectual engagement points when he was at the AU and at the UN, but he was truly not committed to the Pan-African project. The project, if implemented genuinely and sincerely and in record time, would have inevitably removed him and his family from power. And that's something that he didn't want. So when we're having a conversation about the African Union, we need to be very aware of all of the factors that I've just mentioned. We're going to now go into a more academic discussion about what is the AU, what are its bodies, and we're going to then look at the Agenda 2063. And that's where we're going to conclude this first part of the episode. And then we'll continue to discuss next week the other elements of the African Union, the African Charter for Human and People's Rights. We're going to talk about the African Charter for Democracy, Elections and Governance. We're going to look at the African Peer Review Mechanism. All of these things are important to understand, and you should definitely look out for that episode. It's going to be powerful and explosive, but let's go into what is the AU. The African Union is a pan-continental body. It's a pan-African body. And Pan-Africanism, if I were to explain it to you very quickly, It's a political and cultural movement, and it's based on the belief that people of African descent have common interests and should be unified. People of African descent includes people who are in Africa presently, you and I, if you are an African and I am an African and you are an African, but it also includes the African diaspora, people in Jamaica, even in Brazil. The African diaspora is made up of modern immigrants, like people who've left Africa due to oppression as refugees, who've gone to seek out greener prospects, doctors, engineers. We know about the brain drain phenomena, but it also includes ADOS, which are the African descendants of slaves. So in its narrowest interpretation, Pan-Africanists envision a united African nation where all people of the African diaspora can live. So the African Union is a pan-continental body, a pan-African body. But the African Union, as you know it, is the second formulation of that particular body. The first entity was the Organization of African Unity. The 25th of May, 1963 is a significant day because that's when we consider it to be Africa Day and the beginning of the Pan-African project on this particular continent. So if ever you wondered why is the 25th of May Africa Day, that's when the Organization of African Unity was founded. So what happened on that day? 32 heads of independent African states met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to sign the charter creating Africa's first post-independence continental institution, and they called it the Organization of African Unity. The OAU was the manifestation of the Pan-African vision for an Africa that was united, free, and in control of its own destiny. The Organization of African Unity Charter spelled out the purpose of the organization, namely, to promote the unity and the solidarity of African states, to coordinate and intensify their cooperation and efforts to achieve a better life for the peoples of Africa, to defend their sovereignty, their territorial integrity and independence, to eradicate all forms of colonialism from Africa, and to promote international cooperation having due regard to the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was the first formation, the Organization of African Unity. But obviously, we're not sitting with the Organization of African Union. What is the reason for the shift? So there was a declaration which was made in Libya in a city called Sirte. And that declaration, it was made on the 9th of September in 1999. Because there was a realization that there was a loss of momentum in terms of the African project. There was a realization of the harms of globalization on African states particularly, and there was a push for a revitalized entity. One of the people who was pushing for this was Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. On that day, the heads of state of the government of the Organization of African Union issued the Sirte Declaration, calling for the establishment of an African Union with a view to accelerating the process of integration in the continent to enable Africa to play its rightful role in the global economy while addressing multifaceted social, economic, and political problems, compounded as they were by certain negative aspects of globalization. It took 3 more years for this African Union to actually come into formation. In July of 2002, in Durban, South Africa, that's when the African Union as a project began. That was encapsulated in the AU vision. And what that vision said is that the AU is guided by a vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. Some of the key ideas which came at the very beginning of this African Union project were ideas such as an African continental free trade area, an African passport. But as I said, we'll talk about those ideas next week. How does it work? So you have some decision-making bodies within the African Union, and those decision-making bodies constitute of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government, the Executive Council, the Permanent Representatives Committee, the Specialized Technical Committees, the Peace and Security Council, and the African Union Commission. Just to give you an idea of the African Union Assembly, which is one of the key decision-making bodies, this is formerly known as the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government, formally, not formally, So the English there is getting a bit tricky, but the formal name, as in the name in a suit, formerly known as the African Union Assembly of Heads of State and Government. The chairperson of the African Union is the ceremonial head of the African Union, elected by the Assembly of the Heads of State and Government for a one-year term, and this rotates among the continent's 5 regions. Controversially, Robert Mugabe was the chairperson in 2015. Also controversially, Muammar Gaddafi, when he was chairperson in 2010, tried to extend his term of office beyond the one-year term. This is because he was still trying to implement his African United States vision. Now, the Assembly has 9 basic functions. Number 1, it sets the policies of the Union. Number 2, it decides on what action to take after consideration of the reports and recommendations from other organs of the Union. Number 3, it considers membership requests into the Union. Number 4, it creates bodies for the Union. Number 5, it monitors the implementation of policies and decisions of the Union, as well as ensuring compliance by all member states. Number 6, it creates a budget for the Union. Number 7, it provides direction to the Executive Council on conflicts, war, and other emergency situations and the restoration of peace. Number 8, it selects judges for and withdraws judges for the Court of Justice. Technically, that's the African Court for Human and People's Rights right now, but it's supposed to be the African Court of Justice. But that's a story for another day. Look out for that episode. There's a whole discussion there. Number 9, it appoints the chairman of the commission, the commissioners of the commission, and all respective deputies, and determines how long they will serve and what duties they will perform. So I hope you're getting an idea of what and how the African Union is and how it operates. So let's talk about this Commission of the African Union, because that's one of the more important bodies aside of the General Assembly. So the Commission of the African Union, or the African Union Commission, you must not confuse it with the African Commission for Human and People's Rights. That's a different entity within the African Union. Now, this entity acts as the executive and administrative branch, or the Secretariat of the African Union. It's headquartered in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. It consists of a number of commissioners dealing directly with issues of policy. The chairperson of the African Union Commission is the head of the African Union Commission. And on January 30, 2017, it was announced that Charles Moussa Faki would become the chairperson. And he was preceded by Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma of South Africa. And under Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, that's where you saw this push for the Agenda 2063. So that was one of her signature projects and one of the legacy projects that will continue to exist. So in a sense, while she may not have won presidency in South Africa so far, one of her bigger contributions is actually getting this agenda document on the table. However, as I've said, the timeline of that agenda is questionable, right? So those are the decision-making bodies. I've given you an insight into 2 of them. You still have judicial bodies of the African Union. These are the deliberative bodies with legal authority to determine issues, but there are complications which we'll discuss at a later stage. But here are the judicial bodies of the African Union. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, the AU Commission on International Law, the AU Advisory Board on Corruption, and the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. So those are the judicial bodies within the African Union. So I hope that it's beginning to take shape. I didn't mention this, I think, at any given point, but the African Union is a 55-member body right now. That's how many entities are part of the African Union. Having said that, let's discuss this Agenda 2063 and think about what it means. The Agenda 2063 is a strategic framework for the socio-economic transformation of the continent. It has a 50-year time frame from the year 2013. So we're 7 years into it, and we should realistically beginning to see some of the advancements. But, question marks on that. It has a set of initiatives that have been proposed and are currently under implementation by the African Union. Now, the documents which precede the Agenda 2063 are the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty, the Minimum Integration Program, the Program for Infrastructural Development in Africa, PIDA, and the New Partnership for Economic Development, NIPAD. Now, the timeline of this Agenda 2063 and how it came into being. The call was made at the 21st Ordinary Assembly on the 26th of May 2013. It was adopted on 31 January 2015 at the 24th Ordinary Assembly of the Heads of States and Governments of the African Union in Addis Ababa. So one of the cool things to note is that the timeline coincided with the 50th anniversary of the Pan-African project, whether it's the Organization of African Union or the AU. There was a recognition that, hey, we've been at this for 50 years. What's happening? While we have been effective at making sure that there's no longer colonialism and apartheid, we haven't actually dealt with poverty, with living conditions, with governance, with human rights, with democracy. And that's why in 2013, this push was made almost to create a new runway for the African project. So that's a significant thing to know. The 7 stated key goals of the Agenda 2063 are the following. Number 1, economic development, which includes the eradication of poverty within 1 generation. A generation is generally considered to be between 20 and 30 years. Number 2, political integration, in particular through the establishment of a federal or confederate united Africa. Number 3, improvements in democracy and justice. Number 4, the establishment of security and peace on the entire African continent. Number 5, the strengthening of cultural identity through an African Renaissance and Pan-African ideals. Number 6, gender equality. Number 7, political independence from foreign power. Now, there are some flagship projects which fall under the Agenda 2063, and there's 15 of these flagship projects which have been identified as being key to enabling and accelerating progress in all areas of development. Here they are. Number 1, a high-speed train network connecting all African capitals and commercial centers. Sounds amazing. Number 2, the formulation of a strategy for transforming the African economy from a supplier of raw materials to one that actively uses its own resources. Amazing. Number 3, the establishment of a continental free trade area. Number 4, the introduction of the African Union passport and the removal of all visa requirements for its holders within Africa. Now, that's going to be controversial across the continent, especially in the richer African states. Number 6, the construction of a 3rd Inga Dam. Number 7, the establishment of the single African air transport market. Number 8, the establishment of an annual African Economic Forum. Number 9, the establishment of a set of financial institutions envisioned as an African Investment Bank, a Pan-African Stock Exchange, an African Monetary Fund, and an African Central Bank. Number 10, a Pan-African Digital Data Network. Number 11, the development of a common African strategy for the use of outer space technology. So there's even a space program. Number 12, the establishment of an African Open Digital Distance Learning University. Number 13, cooperation on cybersecurity. Number 14, the foundation of a great African museum, preserving African cultural heritage and promoting Pan-Africanism. Number 15, the compilation of an Encyclopedia Africana as the authoritative resource on the authentic history of Africa and African life. Wow. All of those things sound amazing. All of those things sound, if you could get all 15 of them, Africa would be a brilliant space to live, and we would be telling Europeans and Americans that we don't want them in our country. We don't want them in our area. They must go back to America, go back to Europe, go back to China. If we could get all 15 of these things, we would be well on the way, but we've already spoken about why some of these things are not necessarily on the track that they're supposed to be. What's been the progress? So firstly, the first continental report on the implementation of the Agenda 2063 was presented by President Ouattara of Ivory Coast only in 2020 on the 10th of February. And there's supposed to be biennial reporting cycle, so every 2 years. And that's not good enough. It's just not good enough. I mean, this continental report on the implementation of the agenda is a good step. But once again, you continue to see that there's just not enough urgency in this regional body. You know, that report measures progress against a set of goals defined for the first 10-year implementation plan, and it was launched together with an interactive online dashboard which shows progress in the individual areas of the agenda as well as the geographic regions. Not been able to find that dashboard myself. Maybe you can get some luck with it. In terms of the special projects, there's a little bit of good news here, right? Because the African Continental Free Trade Area, it was established by an agreement adopted in March 2018 and is operational actually from the 1st of July 2020, although, you know, this is happening in the context of COVID-19. The African Investment Bank and the African Monetary Fund are nominally established. The headquarters are supposed to be built in Tripoli, which is in Libya, and in Yaoundé, which is in Cameroon, respectively. And Egypt is supposed to be the host of the African Space Agency. I can tell you right now that a critical challenge that's happening right now is that you're not going to get these things built in those particular territories because Libya is a war zone right now and Cameroon is also going through a lot of conflict. You've got this secessionist movement which is happening in parts of Cameroon which wants to separate Anglophones and the Francophones are not seeing eye to eye. And Cameroon is a hotbed right now of instability and is not necessarily going to be able to create this African entity that we want to see. So that's a story for another day, what's happening in Cameroon. Definitely going to do an episode on it. You should watch out for that. Now, here's some progress on the Pan-African Virtual and E-University, which is called Purview. This has been created as the digital arm of the Pan-African University and is offering an initial set of 3 courses. Many of the projects that have been mentioned are held back by a lack of funding. If you're talking about the high-speed train network, the space agency, and the Inga Dam. So the African Union continues to have a problem that it doesn't have enough budget for the things that it wants to do. And part of that is because a lot of the African states are not contributing. And as well, a lot of the money is coming from the outside, from Europe, from other actors. In fact, China built the new African Union buildings and they actually planted some spyware in those buildings. It's another scandal for another day, but it just also shows how tricky it is for the African Union to operate with independence and autonomy while it hasn't sorted out a lot of issues. So I'm going to end the episode off here. I want to say that the African project is an important project. And it does require all of us as Africans to be involved. And we have to start thinking about how do we actually help fix Africa? How do we help fix the African Union? So I hope as I was discussing some of these key areas in terms of the African Union as an entity, the Agenda 2063, your mind is already beginning to have sparks and inspiration for you to start saying, hey, I need to check that. I need to get involved in that. I need to see if I can contribute money towards that. Because the reality is these old men are not going to transform Africa and create the Africa that we deserve. So it's on us. So as much as we're learning about Africa and creating knowledge, we also have to start thinking very, very actively about what are we going to do to make sure that Africa actually works for us. It's a young continent, the median age is 20. So that means that we need to be thinking, these old people are done, they've collected their money, they've got their mansions, their families are sorted, their kids have gone to Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, they've looted. They are not really driven by the urgency that we are driven by. We see what's happening in the world, we see how Africa is falling behind. So let's get involved in fixing the problem. That's all the time we have for today. I'll catch you in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay pursuing your passion.